It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome back into another podcast by George. Well, it's time for another house call. Dr. Politics, Stephen W. Schmidt, the professor emeritus from Iowa State University, the man that spent over 50 years in the classroom teaching political science and authored this book right off of my left, which is, it's the authority. It is the book that has been in more political science, college classrooms anyway, than any other. So we're delighted to have him back on a podcast by George. Welcome back, Doc.
Thank you. When you do these Zoom things with your pets and stuff around, you never know what's going to happen. But yes, sir. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you back, and we've got a hell of a lot to talk about. And maybe first on the agenda, I don't know, in the great Midwest here, sometimes it doesn't rise to the top, but it should, and it's that situation in Gaza. And I kind of wanted to start off with this an email and a news release that I just got from our good friends at Code Pink, and kind of let people know where I'm at on this. As you know, Biden just approved a massive new arms sale. Actually, it's a gift, says Code Pink, to Israel. And they want Congress to block the sale. They're calling on Congress to do that. Of course, that's extremely unlikely. But folks may not realize Israel receives $3.8 billion every year from the U.S. in military aid to oppress and massacre Palestinians. Now, again, this is from Code Pink. Already over the past 10 days, Israel has killed over 200 Palestinians in Gaza, almost a third of them children. In the West Bank, they have been shooting protesters with live ammunition. So why has President Biden just approved the sale? And as they point out, it isn't really a sale, as Israel will be purchasing those weapons with the money the U.S. gave them of $375 million more in precision-guided weapons. And, Doc, this Israel thing is crazy on a lot of fronts. I just had Ron Placone on, and we talked about some of the statistics, which are amazing. Now, as folks can well imagine, the people in Israel, by and large, Israel's not a poor nation. We give them $3.8 billion every year. And the thing with billions and millions is kind of interesting. That equals over $10 million a day that we give to direct aid to Israel. And that's just mind-boggling. They get $500 basically for every citizen in Israel in the form of, a UBI, if you want to call it that. I mean, we are supporting the hell out of Israel. And here, right in the midst of this situation in Gaza, we give them money for precision-guided weaponry.
George, name me a president since 1948. Why 1948? Your viewers and listeners of the podcast are asking. Because in 1948, Israel became a state. The British left. They made it a place of refuge for Jews who were being killed in Germany and all over the place. The history of it is that it's the Jewish homeland. It's also the Palestinian homeland. It's also Arab homeland for many. And so with Jerusalem as the capital of the three biggest religions in the world, and people saying this is where our ancestors are from, it is a nightmare because since 1948, there have been many wars. There has been a lot of death and destruction. The Palestinians have been essentially locked up in what are called refugee camps, George, refugee camps, since 1948. Now, in my opinion, Gaza is, when you look at the map of that area, is an impossible little geographic cancer because it is never going to be viable. It is tiny. It is the most crowded geographic area in the world. And so conflict is almost necessary or something that you would expect. The United States has always supported Israel because Israel was the country that had elections, that had a free press, that was, quote, the only democracy in the Middle East. It was the country that basically was the enemy of our enemies. Remember, it was the country that stood up, Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Egypt invaded and tried to run over Israel, much to their regret. And so what you do, and, we think differently, but regimes, governments think the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and I don't care what they do. And so Israel has been the counterweight to the Arab countries and to Iran, and it's geopolitics. And that's why you give money to them, There isn't any morality in international politics, my friend. And I know liberals, progressives want to fall back on morality. And that is the lovely part of liberals and of progressives, that they want to do things that are moral. And the world, in my opinion, is not ready for that. There has to be something enormous happening before Americans, Congress, public opinion will say, we got to do something different here. American public opinion is very divided, by the way, on this. It is not 100%, and certainly not even sometimes 50% in favor of what we're doing. But that's the way it is. And yes, we have to talk about it. We have to say we got to do something different. But for the next 24 hours, we're not going to.
Yeah, and maybe beyond. We kind of stick our heads in the sand.
1948.
Yeah. I want to kind of emphasize what the doc's talking about there with Gaza. It's the part of the psychodrama that really strikes me about this. If anybody that's watching this podcast has ever been in a serious, particularly earthquake, one of the things that's most frightening about an earthquake, out of all the human catastrophes and disasters, is that there's no place to run. There's no place to hide. I mean, the earth is literally collapsing around you. Well, in Gaza, it's 25 miles long. It's 7 miles wide. There is no escape. It is blockaded. You couldn't get out of there if you wanted to. It's an open air prison, and these missiles are coming in, and it's just a horrific situation. And before we leave this topic, I want to underline or emphasize something that everybody forgets about. Joe Biden's Secretary of Defense and his Secretary of State are Raytheon board members and war industry lobbyists. Now, that Austin guy, I think he's still on the board of Raytheon. And Blinken, I think, gave up his seat with that lobbying firm for the defense contractors. But that's where those guys came from. And then here we are giving these damn precision-guided missiles to Israel. And during the Obama administration, I know the doc does too, we gave them bunker busters. Well, what the hell? Well, where are they busting bunkers at? They don't need bunker-busting bombs. Yeah, they do, if they're going to blow up these buildings in Palestine, and that's what's taking place. I hope that they can come to their senses and get a ceasefire here very shortly. Biden supposedly has encouraged that on the phone. I guess the United States did not stand behind a ceasefire, I know, at the United Nations. So let's hope that they set them aside here shortly, and things can go back to the horrible normal, really, for the Palestinians in that Gaza situation.
Horrible normal. And don't forget, if you live anywhere in Israel, how many thousands of those Iranian Katyusha inaccurate missiles were fired randomly into Israel, blowing up on streets and killing a few people and hurting a few people, because the Iranians, you got to remember, have been strong supporters of Hamas, which is the group that is dominant in Gaza and among Palestinians to some extent. And so the Iranians are involved. And our U.S. relationship with Iran, how great that is. And the name Hamas, if you spelled it differently in Spanish, you know what Hamas means in Spanish?
Nope.
It means never. So if I say to you, jamás tenemos la paz en ese territorio, it means we will never have peace, because jamás means never. And that's so ironic to me every time I hear it, because it's like, It's an appropriate name. I don't think you and I are going to live long enough to see peace coming to that part of the world. And the Trump peace between, Arab states and Israel and Middle Eastern peace completely ignored the Israeli-Palestinian tensions, wars, death, destruction, completely ignored it. So as a result, it meant that nothing for what we're looking at now. It had nothing to do with the single biggest conflict center of that part of the world. So let's move on. Let's try to figure out a way to, have the Palestinians have their own homeland. And honestly, they're probably going to have to eventually accept the fact that Israel is an independent country and not constantly say that, no, Israel is illegitimate and we're going to end the Jewish state, because that isn't going to work either, even though it may make some sense to some people. I don't want to be a Middle East peace negotiator, George.
Well, we don't have time for it on the podcast. Obviously, we couldn't sort this out if we wanted to, if we spent our lifetime on it, let alone in 25 minutes. But I did want to talk about another situation, a siege that's taking place, or did take place, and some fear in the nation's capital. It reads, many are fearful in a divided U.S. House. This is from the Associated Press. I really like this. Colorado Representative Jason Crow, a former Army Ranger who served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, said it took time for him to stop constantly scanning his environment for threats when he returned from war 15 years ago. And that's pretty common. You'll hear about these guys. We've had Matthew Ho, a combat veteran, on the podcast before, and he talks about PTSD and how it's when you're used to being on the hunt and when you're used to being hunted, it's hard to give that up. I remember from my childhood after the Vietnam War, a guy I knew walking through the aisles of Kmart, the guy hit the deck when something fell off of a shelf. I mean, they're kind of conditioned that way. Yeah. But anyway, it reads, after the violent insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, Crow said he's picked up the habit again. He was trapped with several other members of Congress in the upper gallery of the U.S. House that day while a mob of President Donald Trump's supporters tried to beat down the doors of the chamber and stop the certification of President Joe Biden's victory. And so they're talking about doing something to increase the security in the U.S. Capitol, yet some of the Republicans, as you know, Doc, are trying to downplay the significance of this. It's all over the liberal media outlets in particular. The number one story probably isn't Gaza. It's probably this, if you tune in MSNBC. What's your take on it?
It's a political event that cannot be resolved and really can't even be discussed as a purely impartial, bipartisan question of who did what and how to improve security, because the Republicans see it as a democratic effort to continue essentially to point out to people what happened, which, you can just watch the videos. People are carrying banners that say Trump. And people are beating each other up and spraying stuff at cops, and people are there with guns, either protecting, the House chamber with the tables pushed up against it. So the Republicans really don't want to go there. They don't want to go there because they say, this is over with, and it was a mixed event. Some people were there because they thought that really American democracy was at risk because the Democrats were going to take over illegally, and others went there because they're basically revolutionaries of some sort. Some people call them terrorists, and all of that is too messy. And so the House will pass the bill that would set up this bipartisan commission with, experts who are going to look at what happened and how to avoid it, and the Senate is going to turn it down. So, it's the usual story, George, the usual story. We are a country deeply, deeply divided, and if any of you folks listening to me or watching me, if you're watching, want me to come and give the keynote speech to your organization, I do keynote speeches for all kinds of businesses. I need to pay my bills. I don't do them for free anymore because I can't afford it. I'm unemployed now.
Oh my
So
God.
I will give you the skinny on why we are where we are. And it has nothing to do with Donald Trump. And it has nothing to do with Joe Biden. And it has nothing to do with the attack on the Congress. We are a country that has been splitting apart like an amoeba. You remember biology? You have an amoeba
Yeah.
and it splits, and then
Yeah.
this amoeba splits. But our amoeba is just two splits: Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals. Liberals maybe are socialists too, and Republicans, some of them are maybe fascists to some people. We have been on a path to today for about 25 or 30 years. It is not something that suddenly happened and that you suddenly optimistically, oh, we're going to get together and we're going to figure out why this happened and then we're going to stop it. No, I'm sorry. I'm not a pessimist. I'm a realist.
Well, that's why I'm a proponent. I know we disagree on this. I think you think I'm kind of wasting my hot air, but I'm a proponent of this idea with the People's Party on the left side of the Democratic Party trying to get underway, trying to get just a 5, 10, 15% support of current Democrats so that the Democratic Party, like that amoeba or like mercury is what I think of it as, like when you separate mercury in a high school lab, and it comes back together to knit together. Well, the Republicans already went through that with the Freedom Caucus. They're kind of going through it with QAnon right now. It's pushing that mercury further to the right with the Republican Party to where they refuse to acknowledge reality, like the security situation at the U.S. Capitol. Well, I would love to see the Democratic Party do the same thing, because the Democrats, I know you disagree on some of this, Doc, but I believe that they've been running to the right ever since Ronald Reagan came along, and he brought into the Republican Party those Southern Dixiecrats and people that were really leaning right, and the Democrats have been chasing those people ever since, and the whole thing has gone to the right, and that has a lot to do with where we are today. And talking about the right,
no, I agree with you,
Yeah.
George. I agree with you. I think
great.
that we need more than two political parties, because you can't jam all the different alternatives into two. You can't do it with cereal, right? You've been to the grocery store. Imagine if you only had two cereals. Captain Crunch and Choco Nuts. You can't do it. We need more than two parties, but the system doesn't really allow third parties to flourish. The system is a monopoly of the two parties. Everything that you have to do to make a party work, viable, get support, get on the ballot is skewed to the Democrats and Republicans. And by the way, I think we are imagining a history before Ronald Reagan where the Democrats were a really progressive liberal party of the left. They weren't.
No.
The Democrats, look, just, people come and argue with me at these events when I speak to a group of, bankers or a group of, community leaders. And they say, well, you're wrong. Look at John F. Kennedy. Good Lord.
Yeah,
Look at John F. Kennedy. I mean, you think he was a liberal? John F. Kennedy was pro-life. John F. Kennedy was a big supporter of the military. He got us slowly started into the Vietnam War. He got assassinated, but he started us in that direction. We overthrew Castro because he was a communist. And look at where that has left us with, no result. So which of the Democrats, and FDR was not really a liberal either.
No, they made him into a liberal. They forced him into becoming a liberal because the socialist
Well, sure, but the economy was collapsing, and he was a pragmatist, and he said, well, we got to employ all these people. Why do we have to employ all these people with public works, to build public libraries and national parks and things? Why? Because the socialists and the communists were beginning to get large numbers of people coming to their parties and voting for them. And the fear was, if we don't do something to help out here and get these people back on our side, we're going to have a real problem. We're going to have a big socialist party and a big communist party. And so it was partly, self-protection that led to, Social Security and some of these other welfare programs. And, certainly, apparently, his wife was a big influence, and she was very liberal and kind and nice. But we haven't had many progressive governments. I mean, Bill Clinton, we put an end to welfare as we know it.
Oh yeah. Expanded the prison population, a big crime, anti-welfare president. And I agree with you 100% also. The Democratic Party, whatever it was, became Republican, I believe, basically, after Ronald Reagan. And this is to quote the Pulitzer Prize winning Chris Hedges. And he said that pushed the Republican Party so far right that they became crazy. And that's kind of where we are today. And we don't have that left that goes all the way back to FDR. Well, we're out of time. I'm going to lose you today. I wanted to catch you on just one thing here because it's big news and I don't know exactly what to make of it. And you're one of the guys that was actually around and remembers 1973 pretty well. I mean, I was coming out of high school, but you were maybe even already teaching. And
oh yeah,
yeah. What I wanted to talk to you about was this Roe v. Wade thing coming out of Mississippi. They're challenging that in the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, which is now conservative, they have the majority on the court. They're saying they're going to hear it. And people are saying that it could be the end of Roe v. Wade. And most people nowadays don't know anything but Roe v. Wade because it was 1973 when that came into play. Now, the one thing I'll say about this, Doc, I saw Nancy Pelosi, of all people, interviewed probably in the past year or so, and she kind of let the cat out of the bag. And she was talking about Republicans, and she said, yeah, they've been talking about Roe v. Wade for years. She says it's never going to happen. They're not going to do it. They won't do it. They use it for fundraising. That's what Pelosi said. What she was also revealing, that she didn't seem to realize, it was the Democrats do the same thing. That is the linchpin, maybe, of the modern Democratic Party. It's Roe v. Wade. So all of that said, Doc, is something going to happen here, or is this just going to stay status quo?
It is a litmus test, absolutely, for both Democrats and Republicans for different reasons. But if you look at the facts, pro-choice has basically been losing the battle, even with Roe v. Wade still the law of the country. I saw Matt this morning preparing for your show because you knew you would throw a spin ball at me and I would have to hit that somehow. The map showed all the places in the United States where it is virtually impossible to get an abortion if you need one because the states have limited how and where you can get an abortion, but without, except in some cases, banning abortions completely because that violates Roe v. Wade, which says that a woman has a right to choose. It actually says a woman has a right to privacy. Most of my students are always shocked when I do my class unit on Roe v. Wade and civil liberties. And I say, it's not about abortion. It happens to have been an abortion case, but the Supreme Court never said abortions are legal. They said a woman has a right to privacy. That was what the case was. And if a woman's privacy involves her relationship with her doctor, and it happens to be that it involves an abortion, then she has the right to that privacy, and the government shouldn't take that away. But the Congress of the United States, since 1973, when Roe v. Wade came down, has never been able to pass a bill making abortion legal. Never able to do it. Even when the Democrats control the Congress, the House and Senate, because it just won't fly. You can't get a majority of Americans to support politicians who want to basically make abortion legal that way. Of course, there are many who do, but it's the third rail. It's the third rail. What is the third rail? We don't have that in Iowa, but it is the electric rail of the subway system and some electric trains. And if you touch that rail, which is in the middle, it's not where the wheels are, it's where the contact is. Yeah. If you touch that third rail, you're dead. And Roe v. Wade is the third rail of politics. And even Democrats, they're in favor of abortion, but they've never been able to pass a bill on it in Congress.
Well, Doc, we're out of time. Class is over. The alarm bell's ringing here for this edition of Podcast by George. My God, I'm old enough that I remember when the alarm bell in the hallway wasn't even electrified. They rang it by hand. I mean, I went to a school by that to let people know that class was over. Doc, thanks again, as always, for coming on a Podcast by George.
My pleasure.
Folks, I hope you enjoy Stephen W. Schmidt. He's Dr. Politics. I mean, he's heard and seen around the world. He is one of the world's foremost authorities on the American political scene, and we're delighted to have him on Podcast by George. And if you want to see more episodes with the Doc, if you want to see more of us, just go to podcastbygeorge.com. You can subscribe on any platform that you like. You can watch us if you want to see us. If you want to hear us, we're on those podcasts. You can hear us on iTunes particularly. But that's going to do it for today. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.